Hi everyone, my name is Zoe Alger, and today I'm going to be talking about psychological causes and impacts of sexual dysfunction and dysphorias. To begin the presentation, I do want to emphasize that sexual health is often talked about in physical terms when we discuss dysphorias and dysfunctions, but it's important to understand how our emotions, our relationships, environmental factors, work factors can actually contribute to the causes of dysfunctions and dysphorias. And understanding this can also help us better understand each other, reduce the stigma, and encourage each other to seek help and medical care. So, before we get any further, I do want to differentiate the difference between a sexual dysfunction and a sexual dysphoria because they are two different things. A sexual dysfunction is difficulty during any stage of sexual activity, desire, arousal, orgasm, or pain. And then we have a sexual dysphoria, which refers to a state of emotional distress, discomfort, or dissatisfaction with one's related sexual experiences, identity, functioning, or body in a sexual context. So, like I said, sexual dysphorias and sexual dysfunctions are not the same. And it is important to understand that difference because sometimes referring to a sexual dysphoria as a sexual dysfunction can come across a little bit disrespectful and vice versa. So it's very important to be educated on the two terms and understand the difference between them. So to help us understand it a little bit further, I've listed 3 common dysfunctions and 3 common dysphorias to kind of help differentiate a little bit further. So, to begin, we have erectile dysfunction, which is probably one of the most common dysfunctions you hear about, and that is the inability to get and keep an erection firm enough for sexual activity. So, there we have a physical aspect, such as the firmness of the penis. And then we have anorgasmia, which is persistent inability to achieve orgasm despite responding to sexual stimulation. So once again, stimulation is physical. So your mind obviously thinks of the physical aspects. Then we have vaginismus, which is painful spasmodic contraction of the vagina in response to physical contact or pressure. So we have pressure, then we have contraction of the vagina, more physical aspects there. Common to think about. You don't often think about the emotional aspects of that. And then for dysphorias, one of the most known dysphorias is gender dysphoria. So that is the condition of feeling one's emotional and psychological identity to be at variance with one's birth sex. This is often referred to as transgender in today's society. And then we have postcoital dysphoria, which is usually feelings of sadness, anxiety, agitation, or melancholy that occur immediately after consensual sexual activity. So there we have feelings, physical feelings such as sadness, anxiety, agitation, physical. And then we have premenstrual dysphoric disorder. While this isn't technically a sexual dysphoria in terms of intimacy, this is still a pretty common dysphoria in terms of sexual health. So that's why I mentioned it in this presentation. But basically, it causes significant distress or impairment in menstruating women during the luteal phase of their menstrual cycle. So now that you understand that there's a difference between dysfunctions and dysphorias, dysfunctions are more of a physical, actually happens during sex, mainly common in the physical attributes, which go hand in hand with the common physical understanding of sexual health. We also have dysphorias, which are more about the emotions associated with the sexual activity. So now that we understand a little bit about the differentiation, we're going to look a bit more into the psychological causes of each. So we're going to break it down more. So first we have the psychological causes of dysfunctions. So mental health and sexual health, as I've mentioned multiple times, are connected. And anxiety puts our bodies in fight or flight, which is not really ideal for intimacy. And depression, on the other hand, blunts interest in pleasure entirely. So not being able to perform sexually can make depression worse. And depression can make dysfunction more likely. So depression reduces libido, and some statistics we have here is 85% of men with erectile dysfunction report anxiety. If you have anxiety around sex, it makes you not want to have sex more because you have those fears in your mind. And then we have 70% of depressed individuals report sexual difficulties because they have a struggle getting aroused. their sex drive, as some people refer to it, becomes lower. And then erectile dysfunction in specific triples the risk of depression because people feel like they can't perform as well. That anxiety around it that we talked about earlier. I forgot how to speak for a second. Sorry, guys. I have an image on the right that kind of breaks it down a little bit further. So, like emotional factors of sexual activity, physical factors, and additional factors that affect libido and sexual pleasure. I think this really emphasizes how different external factors can affect you physically in terms of your sexual activities. So, our experiences as well and our relationships shape how we feel about sex. So it is important to understand that, like, survivors of trauma may associate sex with pain or fear rather than a positive experience. So if a relationship lacks trust or closeness, that tension often spills into the bedroom. That's my cat trying to come into my bedroom. What a nice time. Anyways, but feelings of like poor body image as well. So like if you're feeling unattractive or feeling just not great that day or just feeling insecure, it can also keep people from enjoying intimacy because they feel like they can't perform well due to their appearance, and that plays a role on it as well. So we kind of talked about how like depression, anxiety, trauma, distress, and body image play a role as into dysfunctions, and how being self-aware of these can help prevent any of these anxieties that come along with having said dysfunction. My cat is being crazy, so I apologize. You'll see his tail probably wagging. There it is. Continuing on, we have the psychological causes of dysphoria. So kind of like what we did with the dysfunctions, we're going to do it again for the dysphorias to kind of differentiate this a little bit more. So, like I said, we're going to break this down. So gender dysphoria kind of relates to the disconnect between the identity, like your gender identity versus like your assigned gender. So gender dysphoria causes include internal identity conflict, societal rejection, and 90% of trans individuals report discomfort with sex characteristics. And then we have postcoital dysphoria, which it's not, a lot of people think that postcoital dysphoria is related to like satisfaction, so like whether someone did good enough, finished quickly, the overall experience. It's not necessarily true. Postcoital dysphoria affects up to 46% of women at some point, and a lot of times it just has to do with past trauma, attachment styles, and emotional vulnerability. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily correlate to whether someone's doing a good job or not, despite what people say. And then we have premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is also referred to as PMDD, which affects people hormonally and emotionally. So it causes intense distress during the luteal phase. And while these are different from other dysphorias in terms of like body regulation, it is very important to understand that like it does play a role in someone's depression and anxiety, and due to this it can lead to poor sexual behaviors, which can lead to those depressive and anxiety factors we learned about earlier. So we've touched on it a bit, but I want to dig a little bit deeper on the mental health impacts of sexual dysfunction and dysphorias, because it plays a large role in not just physical health, but mental health. So when sexual dysfunction isn't addressed, it doesn't just stay in the bedroom. It can affect the whole person. So depression, anxiety, shame, all of that, people begin to avoid other aspects of life and sex altogether, which often leads to more isolation and relationship tension. And same goes for dysphoria. The statistics around dysphoria are really heartbreaking. A lot of them do correlate closely to suicidal thoughts. So it's very important to ensure that we are paying close attention to our peers around us who are suffering from dysfunctions and dysphorias. So to kind of touch on a few of the ones that go on the slides, for dysfunctions, 30% of people with the dysfunction avoid intimacy out of fear of failure and embarrassment, which is just heartbreaking to hear because they're already struggling with the dysfunction and then they are struggling more mentally because of it. And then for dysphorias, one that I found interesting was up to 15% of individuals with PMDD have reported suicidal thoughts or behaviors during these periods. And I found that interesting because I had never really thought about how PMDD can lead to suicidal thoughts, but like I said, that's why we discuss it today, so people become more aware. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship impacts, because while this is impacting us personally, it can also feed into our relationships and how we approach them and the effects they have on life. So, when you're in a relationship, sex is part of how people connect. And when that connection breaks down because of dysfunctions or dysphorias, it can damage the entire relationship, whether we want it to or not. And many people are afraid to talk about it, which only tends to create more distance and put a void between the two people. So for dysfunctions, a lot of time, as much as it sucks, people do tend to gain resentment and self-doubt because they feel like they can't do enough for the other partner. So they kind of decide to take a step back and often don't communicate their needs, which leads to that more resentment, which often leads to a split. And then for dysphorias, a lot of time there is more partner conflict and emotional detachment because a lot of times the other partner doesn't fully emotionally understand what you are going through. And even through thorough communication, they don't always understand like the physical feelings that you're going through. And sometimes talking it out doesn't necessarily mean that they will fully comprehend it. So it does often lead to emotional detachment and conflict just because they don't often know what you're going through, which is also why having conversations like this today are important. So we're going to talk a little bit more. We've talked about relationship impacts and mental health impacts, but on the overall quality of life, we're going to take a little bit of a peek at. So, sexual and gender health aren't just personal issues. I do want to point that out. They affect school and work and relationships and overall quality of life. And when people get access to treatment, it helps them feel like themselves, and their lives often dramatically improve. So these are some more statistics on how sexual dysfunctions and dysphorias can negatively impact someone's life. So we have 55% of trans adults say dysphoria limits their ability to work or study, and then around 40% of people with PMDD avoid social engagements and romantic relationships during their periods. So people tend to disconnect. They disconnect from their peers, they disconnect from their partners because of these dysphorias and dysfunctions, which can isolate them and make them feel alone and overall decrease their quality of life. So now that we've talked about gender dysphoria, or not gender dysphorias, we did talk about that, but like sexual dysphorias, which, by the way, since I made that mistake, I'll stop for a second and talk about how never refer to a gender dysphoria as a gender, like a dysfunction. Don't do that. And sexual dysfunction does not automatically equal gender dysfunction. Or, there we go, guys. This is what I'm talking about. Be careful with your wording. And I'll keep this in here because if I did it, you probably will do it too. Sexual dysphorias do not equal gender dysphorias. And gender dysphorias are not gender dysfunctions. Always correct yourself, just like I did right there. That is very important. But now that you've learned about dysfunctions and dysphorias, I'm going to tell you about how you can help. So the most important takeaway from this entire presentation is we all play a role on how we approach dysphorias and dysfunctions, whether you are like a future healthcare provider, a peer, an advocate, whatever you are. How you respond to someone's struggles with sexual dysfunctions or dysphorias matter, in normalizing conversations like, I just made a mistake and I pointed it out and I addressed it, is important to respect the identities and to help bring more awareness to it. So knowing where to direct someone for help and push for access to care that's inclusive and trauma-informed and respectful is very important. Your support can literally save someone's life, making them feel a little bit less isolated and understand that they matter. So please, if you take anything away from this presentation, let it be that. So in conclusion, whether or not we are talking about dysfunction or dysphoria, we need to look beyond the physical attributes and beyond the surface. Psychological causes run deep. They could be from years ago. They could have happened when you were 3 years old. And the impacts can last just as long as those psychological causes. But understanding and being inclusive when it comes to care and healing is very important. And always approaching situations like this with compassion can help people feel a little bit less alone and seek care that they need. So, thank you guys for letting me educate you on sexual dysfunctions and dysphorias. I know it was a little bit of a long presentation, but I really hope that you guys learned a bit more about how the two are caused by psychological and external factors and how we can help lead to a more inclusive environment that encourages seeking healthcare, therapy, and change. Thank you.